I spend a huge amount of time in my teaching looking at the first sentence of The Turn of the Screw. Just the first sentence. And it is an extraordinary sentence. I'm going to read it out to you now to give you a sense of quite how extraordinary it is. So this is the first sentence of the story, The Turn of the Screw. The story had held us round the fire, sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be. I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. This is an extraordinary sentence, I think. So extraordinary that I'm going to read it again so that you can take it in. The story had held us round the fire, sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be. I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. How might we begin to read this sentence? There are certain obvious, nevertheless really important questions to be asked here. Who is the group, the us, that is held by the story? Who is the I, the speaker? And what is the relationship between them? The situation in this sentence, it seems to me, is at once very familiar. An old house, Christmas Eve, a group gathered around a fire, a classic setting for the telling of a ghost story, and yet extremely unfamiliar. We don't know who is speaking. We don't know who this group is. There is a curious somebody who speaks and breaks the silence that the story begins with. It's a story that begins with silence, with a kind of breathless silence in particular. It's also fascinating to me that this story begins with the words, the story. The first words of The Turn of the Screw are the story, announcing, perhaps, that this is a story about the telling of stories, how they get told, and how we read them. So too, I find it fascinating that the story is given a kind of an agency, a kind of a power. It has held the group. How can a story hold a group? How can a group be held by a story? We might think of the story as holding them in a state of suspense, a state of terror, particularly in the case of a ghost story, it seems to me. But this notion of it holding them breathless seems interesting to me too. Not least because if you read this sentence out aloud, as I've just done twice, it leaves you sufficiently breathless. It's such a long, complicated, convoluted sentence that you end up out of breath as a reader. This scene is odd too, I think, as a place to begin a story, because The Turn of the Screw is beginning with the end. A story has just been told. A group is held sufficiently breathless. So we're at the beginning of a story, but we're also at the end of a story, as if there is a chain of stories. And one of the stories precedes the narrative, precedes the story that we're about to read. Now, this preoccupation with stories and storytelling continues over the course of the narrative and over the course of its early stages. Once again, I would really encourage you to pay particularly close attention to the beginnings of stories. The group around the fire are very keen to hear the story that we are about to be told, the story that is The Turn of the Screw. They're impatient to find out the details of the story. But the narrator seems exceptionally reticent, exceptionally unwilling or loath to tell them the story. I'm going to read you now another passage from early on in this narrative, where there is this tension, this conflict between an audience that really wants to get on to the story and a narrator who is loath to tell the story. We know that this is a story that involves some kind of love interest, that the central character, the governess, is in love in some sense with someone or something. Mrs. Griffin, however, expressed the need for a little more light. Who was it she was in love with? The story will tell, I took upon myself to reply. The story won't tell, said Douglas, not in any literal, vulgar way. Okay, so you've got two narrator figures here. You've got an I, who is telling the story to us as readers. And then embedded within that story, you have this other narrator, this figure called Douglas, who is about to tell the story to the group around the fire. Notice once again that there is a preoccupation with stories and the telling of stories in this passage. This is a story, extraordinarily, that won't tell, not in any literal, vulgar way. What is a story that won't tell? How can a story not tell? Well, let's return to the example of the box that I began the podcast with. Because Turn of the Screw, it seems to me, is a kind of a box that cannot be opened, or a box that doesn't have an inside. In other words, this is a story that knows that we want to open it up and to look inside. Who was the central character in love with? What was her motivation? What was her desire? Like Mrs. Griffin, we as readers have a kind of interest and a desire, an agency, a willing to find out what was motivating the central character, the governess, in this narrative. But this is a story which goes out of its way to stop us from being able to look inside. The story won't tell, not in any literal, vulgar way. We can't get inside the box. We can't find out who the governess was in love with. So I'm suggesting that Turn of the Screw is a story that plans to disappoint readerly expectations. Does it make it frustrating for us to read this story? Certainly many students I've taught have found it a very, very frustrating narrative in the way that it won't tell its own story. But I don't find it frustrating, actually. If we can't open the box and look inside, then we have to pay attention to the box. We have to spend time with the box itself, with the story, rather than cast it away in favour of something that is more interesting, presumably. So this, for me, is something really important about the reading of traditional texts. Rather than trying just to look at the content, at the secrets and messages that are hidden inside the story, what about thinking about the story itself? What about spending time with the box and thinking that the story perhaps has its own secrets, is encoded with its own messages? Thanks very much.